Las Vegas 2009, 2:17 a.m. The strip glows like a neon artery pumping light into the desert darkness. Tourists stumble between casinos, clutching plastic cups of watered-down cocktails and dreams that cost more than they can afford. Somewhere in the Bellagio, a newly married couple just lost their honeymoon budget on blackjack. At the MGM Grand, a software engineer from Seattle is explaining to his wife why maxing out their credit card on slots was actually a sound investment strategy. And weaving through this circus of wealth and desperation is Frank Delaney, driving a yellow cab that's older than most of the dealers working the night shift. 67 years old, gray hair thinning to bare scalp, wire-rimmed glasses held together with electrical tape, a slight hunch from 4 decades of sitting behind a steering wheel. He wears the same worn brown jacket every night, the one with the patched elbow and the faded taxi company logo on the breast pocket. "Where to?" Frank asks in his gravelly voice, tired but polite, always polite. His passenger, a hedge fund manager from Connecticut, already drunk at 2 a.m., collapses into the back seat smelling like cigar smoke and expensive cologne. "Caesars, and step on it, my friend. I'm on a hot streak." Frank nods, flips the meter, and pulls into traffic. He's heard this line 10,000 times. The hot streak, the system, the feeling. Everyone who comes to Vegas has a story about how they're different, how they figured it out, how tonight is the night they beat the house. And Frank, who's lived in Las Vegas for 43 years, who's driven taxi through 3 recessions and 2 divorces, who's watched fortunes evaporate faster than water in the Mojave, Frank knows better. "Big night?" he asks because passengers expect small talk. "Brother, I just won 18,000 at craps." 18,000. The hedge fund manager laughs, slaps the seat. "This city is magic, you know? Pure magic." "That's great," Frank says, turning onto Flamingo Road. "You cashing out?" "Cash out? Are you crazy? I'm just getting started. Gonna turn that 18 into 50 by sunrise." Frank doesn't say what he's thinking. That by sunrise, this man will be broke, sobering up in a hotel room, wondering how he's going to explain the credit card bill to his wife. He drops the passenger at Caesars, accepts a $5 tip on a $12 fare, and watches the man stumble toward the entrance, already pulling out his wallet, already lost. Frank sits in the cab for a moment, engine idling, watching the golden lights of the casino entrance. For 43 years, he's watched the same scene play out. Different faces, same story. The house always wins. The house always, always wins. Except maybe, and this thought has been growing in Frank's mind for weeks now, like a seed pushing through concrete. Maybe there's a way to make the house lose. Before we dive into the story of how a broke taxi driver built a machine that beat the most secure casinos in America, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and hit that hype button to share this with other true crime fans. This is the story of the silent wheel job. Frank Delaney wasn't always a taxi driver, though he'd been one long enough that most people couldn't imagine him as anything else. He was born in 1942 in Buffalo, New York, to a steelworker father and a nurse mother who believed education was the only way out of poverty. Frank believed them. He studied hard, earned a scholarship to Buffalo State College, and graduated in 1964 with a degree in mechanical engineering. "Frank was brilliant with his hand," said Robert Chen, his college roommate who later became a professor at MIT. "He could look at any machine, a car engine, a watch, a vending machine, and understand how it worked. He'd take things apart and put them back together better than they were before. We all thought he'd end up at Boeing or Ford, designing something important. Instead, Frank took a job at a small manufacturing plant in Cleveland, married his high school sweetheart Margaret in 1965, and settled into a comfortable middle-class life. They had one daughter, Emily, born in 1968. For 15 years, everything was stable, predictable, safe. Then the manufacturing plant closed in 1980, outsourcing its operations to Mexico. Frank was 38 years old, suddenly unemployed, supporting a family in an economy that had no use for mechanical engineers who specialized in obsolete factory equipment. He bounced between jobs: machine shop supervisor, auto mechanic, maintenance technician at a hospital. Each job paid less than the last. The mortgage became difficult, then impossible. They lost the house in 1984. Margaret wanted to move back to New York, near her family. But Frank had heard about opportunities in Las Vegas. Construction boom, new casinos, growing city. In 1986, they packed everything they owned into a U-Haul and drove west toward the desert and the promise of new beginnings. Las Vegas wasn't kind to us, Frank said years later in one of his few interviews. I thought I'd find work as an engineer, but the casinos didn't need engineers. They needed dealers and janitors and construction workers. I took a job driving taxi because it was the only thing that didn't require connections or certifications. Just a driver's license and the ability to smile at tourists. Margaret hated Las Vegas. The heat, the noise, the constant reminder that other people had money they were throwing away while the Delaney's struggled to pay electric bills. She got a job as a waitress at a diner on Boulder Highway. Emily, their daughter, struggled in school and fell in with a bad crowd. By 1991, she dropped out and moved to California with a boyfriend Frank never met. Margaret died of breast cancer in 2003 after a 2-year battle that bankrupted Frank completely. The medical bills, the treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, the medications, it consumed everything. He sold their small house, moved into a 1-room apartment behind a gas station on Industrial Road, and kept driving taxi because it was the only life he had left. After Margaret died, Frank became a ghost, said Patricia Morales, his landlord at the apartment complex. He'd come home at sunrise, sleep all day, leave at sunset for his shift. Never had visitors, never made noise, never complained. He paid rent on time, always exact change, cash in an envelope. The only time I heard him speak more than 10 words was when he'd mention something he heard on talk radio about mathematics or probability. That seemed to be his only interest. Frank was 61 years old, alone, broke, and invisible. He spent his nights driving drunk tourists between casinos, watching them throw away in one hand of blackjack what Frank made in a week. He'd sit in his cab at red lights, looking at the golden lights of the Bellagio or the Venetian, calculating in his head how many taxi fares it would take to equal what some hedge fund manager was losing on roulette, while laughing about it. Tens of thousands of fares, maybe hundreds of thousands. The math was depressing. Then on a Tuesday night in March 2009, everything changed. Frank picked up a passenger at the Mirage, an elderly man in his 70s, well-dressed, carrying a leather briefcase, and smelling faintly of pipe tobacco. Distinguished-looking, the kind of person who'd spent his life in universities or courtrooms. "Where to?" Frank asked. "Orleans Hotel. And take your time. I'm in no rush." As they drove, the passenger pulled out a notebook and began scribbling equations, muttering to himself. Frank watched in the rearview mirror, curious despite himself. "Working late?" Frank asked. The passenger looked up, smiled. "Retired, actually. Professor Emeritus of Physics at Cal Berkeley. Just amusing myself with a little puzzle." "What kind of puzzle?" "Roulette prediction. Old hobby of mine. The mathematics of projectile motion applied to a rotating wheel. Fascinating system. Seems random, but actually follows very predictable physics if you can measure the initial conditions accurately enough." Frank's interest sharpened. "You can predict where the ball lands?" "In theory, yes. In practice, very difficult. You'd need to measure the wheel's rotation speed, the ball's initial velocity, account for deceleration rates, friction coefficients, but theoretically, absolutely predictable. Just physics." They talked for the rest of the drive. The professor, his name was Dr. Alan Morrison, retired after 40 years teaching physics, explained how roulette wasn't truly random, how the ball's path could be calculated if you had precise timing measurements, how casinos thought they were protected by chaos but were actually vulnerable to mathematics. "Of course, you'd need a computer to do the calculations fast enough," Dr. Morrison said as they pulled up to the Orleans, "and you'd need it hidden from the casino security. Quite the engineering challenge." Frank dropped him off, watched him disappear into the casino. 20 minutes later, Frank's radio crackled. "Got a return fare at Orleans. Same passenger." When Dr. Morrison climbed back into the cab, he seemed slightly flustered. "Forgot I needed to be at the Suncoast, not Orleans. Senior moment. My apologies." "No problem," Frank said. They drove to the Suncoast. Dr. Morrison paid, tipped generously, and walked away. Frank started to pull away, then glanced at the back seat. A notebook lay there, brown leather cover, pages filled with equations and diagrams. Frank grabbed it, jumped out of the cab. "Sir, you forgot your—" But Dr. Morrison had already disappeared into the casino, swallowed by the crowd. Frank stood there holding the notebook, looking at the entrance, then back at the notebook. He should turn it in to lost and found. Should leave it with casino security. Instead, Frank Delaney climbed back into his cab, set the notebook on the passenger seat, and drove home as the sun began to rise over the desert. Frank sat in his tiny apartment, really just a studio with a kitchenette, a bed, a chair, and a small TV, with Dr. Morrison's notebook spread across the folding table that served as his kitchen table and desk. The pages were filled with equations Frank barely understood. Differential equations, trigonometric functions, diagrams of roulette wheels with angles and vectors drawn in precise, tiny handwriting. But there were also sketches, simple mechanical drawings that Frank, with his engineering background, could follow. A device for measuring rotation speed, a timing mechanism, a way to calculate ball deceleration based on acoustic signals. The ball makes a distinct sound when it hits certain points on the wheel. One note read, "If you can time the interval between sounds, you can calculate velocity. From velocity and known friction coefficients, you can predict the sector where the ball will land within a margin of 3 to 4 numbers. 3 to 4 numbers. In roulette, that was everything. The difference between random chance and a genuine edge over the house. Frank read the notebook cover to cover 3 times. Then he started building. His apartment complex had a shared garage where he kept his tools, remnants of his engineering days, old equipment he'd never sold because he couldn't bear to part with them. For the next 2 months, Frank spent every moment he wasn't driving taxi working on a device that might possibly give him the advantage Dr. Morrison had theorized about. He started with the timing mechanism. Using an old laptop he'd bought at a pawn shop for $40, he wrote a simple program, basic code he remembered from a computer engineering course he'd taken in the 70s. The program measured intervals between button presses and calculated average speeds. Then he needed a way to trigger the timing without being obvious. Casinos watch players' hands obsessively. Any device visible on the table or in someone's hand would be spotted immediately by surveillance cameras and pit bosses trained to detect cheating. Frank's solution was elegant: foot pedals. He took apart the brake and accelerator pedals from an old taxi he'd purchased from a junkyard for parts. Using pressure sensors salvaged from the pedals, he created 2 switches he could mount inside his shoes. Step down with his right foot to start timing, step down with his left to stop. The computer, small enough to fit in a modified insulin pump case, would strap to his waist under his shirt. The pedal sensors would run through wires taped along his legs, invisible under loose pants. For output, he needed something subtle. No screens, no lights, no visible signals. He used a vibrating motor from an old pager, the kind that had been obsolete for a decade. The vibrations would tell him which sector to bet on. 1 pulse for sectors 112, 2 pulses for 1324, 3 for 2536. It was crude, imperfect, and cobbled together from garbage and spare parts. But it was his. "I tested it first on online roulette simulations," Frank later explained. "I'd watch videos of real wheels spinning, practice timing the button presses, see if my calculations matched where the ball actually landed. At first, I was wrong more often than right, but slowly, over maybe 500 practice runs, I started seeing patterns. The system worked, not perfectly, but better than random chance. Maybe 20% better, which doesn't sound like much, but in gambling, 20% is enormous." By June 2009, Frank was ready to test it in a real casino. He chose Jerry's Nugget, a small off-strip casino in North Las Vegas that catered to locals, not tourists. The surveillance wasn't as sophisticated as the major casinos. The dealers were older, less attentive, going through the motions after decades of the same job. Frank dressed in his usual clothes, worn khakis, a loose button-up shirt that hid the computer strapped to his waist, comfortable shoes with the pressure sensors embedded in the soles. He looked exactly like what he was, a broke old man gambling with money he couldn't afford to lose. He sat down at the roulette table on a Wednesday afternoon when only 2 other players were present. He ordered coffee, not alcohol, and made small talk with the dealer, a woman in her 50s named Gloria, who seemed glad to have someone to talk to. "First time playing?" she asked. "Oh, I've played a few times over the years," Frank said with a self-deprecating smile. "Never won much, but it's fun." "Good luck," she said, spinning the wheel. Frank pressed his right foot down. The timer started. The ball spun, clicked against the numbered pockets, began to slow. Frank watched, counted in his head, pressed his left foot when the ball passed the zero pocket for the third time. The vibrating motor pulsed once against his hip. Sector 1 through 12. Frank placed a small bet, $5, covering numbers 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. The ball dropped. Number 11. Frank won $30. Gloria smiled. "There you go, good instincts." "Just lucky," Frank said, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone must hear it. He played for 2 hours, testing the system with minimum bets. The device worked better than he'd hoped. Not perfect, but he was winning about 60% of his bets instead of the 33% you'd expect with random guessing. When he left Jerry's Nugget that afternoon, he'd turned $100 into $470. Over the next 3 months, Frank refined the system. He tested it at different casinos, small places with older wheels, places where he could blend in as just another elderly local gambling his Social Security check. Boulder Station, Sam's Town, Arizona Charlie's, the Gold Coast. He learned which wheels were better maintained, which dealers spun more consistently, which times of day had less security attention. He also learned to limit his wins. If he started winning too much, pit bosses would notice. So he deliberately lost some bets, made some random plays, kept his net winnings modest enough to look like normal variance. "The key was patience," Frank said. "I wasn't trying to get rich overnight. I was trying to build a bankroll slowly, invisibly, while perfecting the system. Every night, I'd go home and adjust the timing algorithms based on what I'd observed. Every week, I got a little better." By September 2009, Frank had turned his initial $100 investment into $12,000, a fortune by his standards, but nothing that would trigger casino attention. He was ready for the next phase. The machine worked. That was no longer a question. What Frank needed now was scale. $12,000 was more money than he'd had in years, but it wasn't life-changing. It wasn't enough to retire, to move away from the one-room apartment behind the gas station, to stop driving taxi 16 hours a day just to survive. He needed a bigger score, which meant playing at bigger casinos. The problem was that bigger casinos meant better security, more cameras, smarter surveillance teams, sophisticated software that could detect patterns in betting behavior. Frank spent weeks studying casino security systems, not by breaking in or hacking, but by observing. He'd sit in casinos for hours without gambling, just watching. He noticed that security focused on young players, card counters, people betting erratically or in coordination with others. They didn't pay much attention to elderly locals who played slowly and conservatively. He also noticed shift changes. Between 3:00 and 4:00 a.m., during the transition between night and morning shifts, surveillance teams were less attentive. Dealers were tired. Pit bosses were focused on paperwork. That was his window. On a Friday night in October 2009, Frank walked into the Suncoast Casino with $5,000 in his pocket, nearly half his total bankroll. He wore his usual outfit, comfortable shoes with the sensors, loose pants hiding the wires, a windbreaker covering the computer strapped to his waist. To anyone watching, he looked like a retired cab driver, which he was, gambling away his evening with money he probably couldn't afford to lose. He sat at the roulette table at 3:17 a.m. Only one other player was there, a young woman who seemed more interested in her phone than the game. The dealer, a man named Robert with tired eyes and a name tag that had seen better days, barely looked up. "Good morning. How much would you like?" "Let's start with 500, Frank said, sliding $500 bills across the felt. Robert converted them to chips, a stack of $25 chips that Frank arranged neatly in front of himself. The wheel spun. Frank activated his foot pedals, timing the ball's rotation. One pulse, sector 1 through 12. He placed chips covering numbers 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. The ball dropped into 7. Frank won $225. "Nice start," Robert said, pushing chips toward him. Frank played for 47 minutes. He won 9 times, lost 4 times. When he cashed out, he'd turned 500 into 2,100. But more importantly, he'd proven the system worked at a major casino. Over the next 2 months, Frank expanded his operation. He played at different casinos on different nights, never establishing a pattern, never staying long enough to draw attention, never winning so much that pit bosses would flag his player card. Suncoast on Monday, Red Rock on Wednesday, Green Valley Ranch on Saturday. Back to Suncoast 2 weeks later, but at a different time, with a different dealer. I kept detailed records, Frank said. Which casinos, which tables, which dealers, what time, how much I won. I noticed that certain wheels were more predictable than others. Older wheels with more wear, wheels that hadn't been calibrated recently. I targeted those specifically. By December 2009, Frank's bankroll had grown to $87,000. He'd quit his taxi job in November, telling his dispatcher he was retiring. No one asked questions. No one threw him a party. He simply turned in his cab, collected his last paycheck, and walked away from 43 years of driving through the neon desert. Now he could focus completely on the casinos. Frank didn't set out to steal $32 million. That number gets reported, but it's misleading, Detective James Ortiz of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police would later explain. Frank won that much over 18 months, but he also lost money, paid taxes on reported winnings, and spent money on living expenses. His actual net take was probably closer to 18 million, but 32.8 million is the number casinos reported as total losses attributed to his system. The real operation began in January 2010. Frank had refined his technique to the point where he was winning approximately 65% of his bets, far above the statistical expectation for random roulette play. He'd also developed a network of tactics to avoid detection. He used multiple fake IDs purchased from a document forger in Henderson, not to commit identity fraud, but to cycle through different players' club accounts, so no single identity showed suspiciously consistent wins. He varied his betting patterns deliberately, sometimes playing poorly or randomly to create statistical noise in the surveillance data. He tipped dealers generously, creating goodwill and reducing the chance they'd report him to management. And most importantly, he spread his play across dozens of casinos throughout Nevada and eventually to other states: Reno, Lake Tahoe, Atlantic City, even tribal casinos in California and Arizona. Frank understood that the casino's weakness was their individual accounting systems, Ortiz explained. Each casino tracked its own losses, but there was no centralized database that would show one player winning consistently across multiple properties. As long as he kept his wins at any single casino below their alert threshold, he could fly under the radar indefinitely. From January 2010 to July 2011, Frank Delaney won systematically. At the Bellagio, over 6 visits spanning 4 months, he won $230,000. At the Red Rock, he won $180,000 across 9 sessions. At the MGM Grand, Caesars Palace, the Venetian, and a dozen other major strip casinos, he accumulated wins that individually seemed unremarkable. $20,000 here, $50,000 there, but collectively represented a hemorrhage of money that casinos couldn't explain. He also played in Reno, where older casinos had older wheels and less sophisticated surveillance. In one memorable weekend at the Atlantis Casino, he won $340,000 across 3 nights of play. The beauty of Frank's system, said Dr. Richard Kim, a gaming mathematician who later studied the case, was that it wasn't obviously cheating from the casino's perspective. He wasn't hacking computers, marking cards, or colluding with dealers. He was just an old man who seemed to get lucky more often than probability suggested. Each individual win looked like variance. It was only when you aggregated all the data across multiple properties that the pattern became clear. But Frank wasn't invincible. He had close calls. At the win in March 2010, a pit boss named Michael Torres noticed Frank's betting pattern and started watching more closely. Something felt off, Torres later testified. He'd wait until the ball was already spinning, then make his bets quickly. Most players bet before the spin or early in the spin. This guy waited, and he won way more than he should have. Torres alerted surveillance. They reviewed footage of Frank's last 3 sessions and noticed something strange. Frank's foot movements seemed synchronized with the ball's rotation. Is he pressing something with his feet? One analyst asked. They couldn't prove it from the cameras, which were angled to watch hands and faces, not feet. Torres approached Frank's table. Excuse me, sir. Mind if I check something? Frank looked up, his expression calm but his heart racing. Is there a problem? Just routine. Can you stand up for a moment? Frank stood. Torres examined the chair, the area around the table, looking for anything unusual. He found nothing visible. Sorry to bother you. Just being cautious. No problem at all, Frank said, sitting back down. He played 2 more spins, deliberately lost both bets, then cashed out and left. He never returned to the win. That was the closest call I had, Frank admitted later. After that, I became even more careful. I'd sometimes disable the device and play randomly for entire sessions, just to establish a pattern of losing. Then I'd activate it again at different casinos. It made the whole operation slower but safer. By June 2011, Frank had accumulated over $14 million. He'd moved from the one-room apartment to a modest house in Henderson. Nothing fancy, nothing that would attract attention, just a small 3-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood where everyone minded their own business. He paid cash, told neighbors he'd sold a business and retired. He still lived simply, cooked his own meals, drove a used Toyota Camry, wore the same inexpensive clothes. The only luxury he allowed himself was a small workshop in the garage where he continued refining his roulette device, building improved versions with better sensors and more accurate algorithms. Money wasn't the point anymore, said Angela Rodriguez, a neighbor who occasionally chatted with Frank. He told me once that he'd spent his whole life being invisible, being poor, being someone the world overlooked. And now he had a secret. He'd beaten the system that beats everyone. That feeling was worth more than any amount of money. But invisibility can't last forever. The first red flag appeared in a quarterly audit at the Bellagio in July 2011. Sarah Chen, a gaming compliance analyst, was reviewing unusual player activity when she noticed a pattern. Over the past 18 months, there had been a statistically improbable number of roulette wins by players fitting a similar profile. Older men, solo players, betting patterns that deviated slightly from normal distribution curves. I initially thought it was just variance, Chen said in her report to casino management. Roulette is random, and random systems produce clusters. But when I aggregated the data and ran a statistical analysis, the probability of these wins occurring by chance alone was less than 0.1%. She dug deeper, pulling surveillance footage of the winning sessions. Most of the players were different people, different faces, different IDs, different Players Club accounts. But there were similarities. Older men, usually playing alone during off-peak hours, always betting after the ball was already in motion, always leaving after moderate wins instead of pressing their luck. Chen shared her findings with the Nevada Gaming Control Board, which launched a quiet investigation. Within weeks, they'd identified similar patterns at other major casinos: the MGM Grand, Caesars, Red Rock, the Venetian. The same statistical anomalies, the same player profiles, the same strange betting patterns. We started calling it the silent wheel job, said Detective James Ortiz, who was brought in to lead the investigation. Because whoever was doing this was doing it silently. No signals we could detect on radio frequency scanners, no accomplices, no visible devices. It was like a ghost was beating the casinos. The FBI joined the investigation in September 2011, treating it as a potential organized crime operation. They analyzed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage. They interviewed dealers and pit bosses. They consulted with physicists and engineers about whether roulette prediction was even theoretically possible. The answer was yes, said FBI Special Agent Rebecca Morrison. We brought in experts from MIT and Caltech who confirmed that with precise timing measurements and fast calculations, you could predict roulette outcomes within a narrow range. The question wasn't whether it was possible, it was how someone was doing it without us detecting any electronic signals. They began looking for the technology. RF scanners placed in casinos detected no unusual radio frequencies. They brought in specialists with electromagnetic field detectors who swept tables after suspicious wins. Nothing. Whoever this was, they were using a completely passive system, Morrison said. No wireless transmission, no external communication. Everything was self-contained. Then in October 2011, a breakthrough. A dealer at the Red Rock Casino named Jennifer Gomez mentioned something during a routine interview. There was this one old guy, maybe a month ago, who kept shifting his feet while the ball was spinning, like he was tapping something. I didn't think much of it at the time. Lots of people have nervous habits. But looking back, it was weird. Investigators pulled footage from that session. They zoomed in on the player's feet. There, barely visible, just for a fraction of a second when he adjusted his position, was a wire running from his shoe up his pant leg. "We had him," Ortiz said. They ran facial recognition on the player. His player's club card said his name was Robert Martinez, but the photo on his ID didn't match any Robert Martinez in Nevada DMV records. They expanded the search, running the face through more databases, and they found him. Frank Edward Delaney, age 69, former taxi driver, no criminal record, living in Henderson. "We ran his financial records," Morrison explained. He'd been filing tax returns, reporting gambling winnings, being smart about it, paying taxes to avoid IRS red flags. Over 18 months, he'd reported winning about $4 million. But when we cross-referenced with casino records across multiple states, the real number was closer to 32 million. On November 3, 2011, a warrant was issued for Frank Delaney's arrest. FBI agents and Las Vegas Metro Police surrounded his house in Henderson at 6:01 a.m., expecting possible resistance or an attempt to flee. Instead, Frank opened the door in his bathrobe, blinking sleepily behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Frank Delaney?" Morrison asked. "That's me." "FBI, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of cheating at gambling and theft." Frank nodded slowly. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Would you mind if I got dressed first?" They searched his house while he changed clothes under supervision. In the garage, they found everything. 3 versions of his roulette prediction device, notebooks filled with calculations and casino observations, modified shoes with pressure sensors, a filing cabinet containing fake IDs and players' club cards from 43 different casinos. He documented everything, Ortiz said, like he was running a scientific experiment, not committing a crime. Every bet logged, every win recorded, every adjustment to the algorithm noted in precise detail. They arrested Frank without incident. He didn't resist, didn't lawyer up immediately, didn't demand his rights. He just asked, "Can I bring my notebook? I'd like to finish some calculations while I wait for my hearing." Frank Delaney's arrest made national news on November 4, 2011. Elderly taxi driver accused of stealing $32 million from casinos using homemade computer, read the headline in the Las Vegas Review-Journal. "Roulette Robin Hood, how a broke cabbie beat Vegas," proclaimed CNN. The story had everything media loved: an underdog hero, sophisticated technology built from literal garbage, David versus Goliath, and the ultimate revenge against an industry that symbolized corporate greed to millions of Americans who'd lost money in casinos. Within 48 hours, Frank's mugshot had been shared 500,000 times on social media. Late-night talk show hosts made jokes about it. Saturday Night Live did a sketch where an elderly actor in a cab driver uniform explained roulette physics to confused casino executives. Public opinion was sharply divided, but the divide wasn't what investigators expected. Casino executives appeared on news programs calling Frank a sophisticated criminal who'd stolen millions through technology-aided fraud. "This wasn't clever gambling," said Martin Hastings, CEO of the Nevada Casino Association, speaking to reporters outside the Bellagio. "This was theft, pure and simple. Mr. Delaney used illegal devices to cheat games that millions of honest players enjoy." But thousands, eventually millions, of people saw Frank differently. A Facebook page called Free Frank Delaney gained 40,000 followers in 3 days. Online forums exploded with support. Retired engineers posted detailed analyses of his device, praising its elegance. Physicists wrote blog posts defending his methods. People who'd never gambled in their lives suddenly cared deeply about an elderly taxi driver's legal defense. "He didn't rob anyone," one Reddit comment read, receiving 23,000 upvotes. "He just played smarter." If casinos can use mathematics and psychology and house edges to systematically take money from people, including problem gamblers, poor people, People who can't afford to lose. Why can't someone use mathematics to take money from casinos? The game was rigged against players from the start. Frank just unrigged it. Frank's attorney, a public defender named Patricia Chin, built a defense around the argument that Frank hadn't technically cheated. He'd simply used his own knowledge and a device that measured publicly observable information. The casinos claim my client used a computer to predict roulette outcomes, Chen argued in preliminary hearings. But there's no law in Nevada that explicitly prohibits using timing measurements and mathematical calculations to make betting decisions. Card counters do the same thing mentally. My client just used a tool to assist his calculations. The prosecution countered that Nevada law prohibited using any device to assist in projecting the outcome of a game. Frank's foot-activated computer clearly qualified. The trial was scheduled for March 2012, but Frank never made it to trial. On January 15, 2012, while out on bail, posted by an anonymous donor, later revealed to be a retired mathematics professor who admired Frank's work, Frank Delaney disappeared. His bail bondsman reported him missing when Frank failed to appear for a check-in appointment. Police went to his house in Henderson. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was neat and organized. Dishes washed, bed made, nothing out of place. Except Frank was gone. His car remained in the garage. His bank account showed no activity. His phone went straight to voicemail. On the kitchen table, investigators found a handwritten note. To whom it may concern, I apologize for the inconvenience, but I've decided not to participate in a trial I consider fundamentally unjust. I didn't steal, I outsmarted. If that's a crime, then every casino executive should be in prison beside me. I'm leaving now, and I don't plan to be found. Thank you for the interesting experience. Frank Delaney. The FBI launched a manhunt. They checked airports, bus stations, border crossings. They monitored his daughter Emily's phone and email, though she insisted she hadn't heard from him in years. They searched his financial records for any hidden accounts or assets. Nothing. Frank Delaney had vanished as completely as he'd once been invisible, driving a taxi through Las Vegas. 6 months after his disappearance, a rumor surfaced on underground gambling forums. A man matching Frank's description had been spotted at a small casino in Estoril, Portugal, winning consistently at roulette. FBI agents followed up. Portuguese authorities investigated. They found no evidence of Frank's presence, but the rumors continued. Someone fitting his description in Macau, in Monaco, in a tribal casino in Connecticut. Every few months we'd get a tip, Detective Ortiz said, but they never panned out. Frank was either very good at hiding, or the sightings were just people projecting their desire for him to have gotten away with it. In 2015, an envelope arrived at the Las Vegas Review-Journal containing a letter postmarked from Lisbon, Portugal. I'm writing to set the record straight about the so-called silent wheel job. I didn't steal $32 million. I won it, legally, using mathematics and physics that anyone with my education could have employed. The casinos take billions from people who can't afford to lose. I took a fraction of that from an industry that profits from human weakness. If that makes me a criminal, so be it. But I sleep well at night. A friend of Frank. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive about whether Frank wrote it. The FBI officially closed the active investigation in 2017, though the case remains open and Frank Delaney remains a fugitive. His daughter Emily gave one interview in 2018. I don't know where my father is. We weren't close, but I hope he's okay. I hope he's somewhere warm, doing whatever makes him happy. He spent most of his life suffering quietly while everyone else got rich. If he finally won something, good for him. Today, Frank Delaney's story has become legend in gambling circles. The taxi driver who built a computer from trash and beat the most sophisticated casinos in the world. The device he used is now displayed at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, along with a plaque that reads, The Silent Wheel Device, a homemade roulette prediction computer built by Frank Delaney, who used physics and mathematics to win an estimated $32.8 million before vanishing in 2012. Whether Frank is alive or dead, free or captured, wealthy or broke, nobody knows for certain. But in casinos across America, old-timers still tell his story. And sometimes, late at night when a roulette ball drops into an improbable number, a pit boss will smile and mutter, "Frank's at it again."